In June 2025, headlines once again reopened an old wound in Ireland: the excavation of nearly 800 infant remains from a septic tank at the site of the Bon Secours mother and baby home in Tuam, County Galway. The home, run by Catholic nuns, operated between the 1920s and 1961. For decades, women who became pregnant outside of marriage were hidden away in institutions like this one, forced to give birth in shame, and then often separated permanently from their babies. The discovery of these remains did not surprise survivors. It confirmed what many had long feared: that the system not only abandoned unwed mothers, but quietly erased their children. This tragedy is not isolated. It is a global phenomenon. And while the Tuam case is horrifying, it is far from unique. Ireland's mother and baby homes were not just places for women to give birth. They were factories of silence and separation. More than 18 such institutions operated across the country, many run by religious orders under the authority of the Catholic Church and backed by a state that refused to take responsibility. These homes housed tens of thousands of unwed pregnant women who were often told they were sinners, unworthy of keeping their babies. The children were baptized, named, and then, if they survived, often adopted out, sometimes overseas. Historian Catherine Corliss uncovered death records for 796 children who died at the Tuam home, but found burial records for only one. Later investigations confirmed that the bodies of infants and toddlers had been disposed of in a decommissioned septic tank beneath the property. These children died from preventable conditions: gastroenteritis, respiratory infections, malnutrition. But the deeper cause was institutional neglect, rooted in moral condemnation. Women were punished for becoming pregnant, and their children were seen as symbols of sin, less deserving of care, protection, or life. The institutional shaming of unwed mothers wasn't limited to Ireland. In the United Kingdom, Anglican-run homes also separated mothers and children under the pretense of morality. Similar atrocities were documented at homes such as the Church of England's Bethany home in London. Women were told to give up their babies or face complete social exile. These children were often adopted without informed consent. In Canada and Australia, church and government-run institutions imprisoned Indigenous and non-Indigenous women alike. In Canada, the Mount Cashel Orphanage in Newfoundland and the St. Joseph's Training School for Girls in Ontario are just two of many sites now under scrutiny. Many of these homes also played a role in the mass forced adoptions that have since prompted official government apologies. In Australia, the notorious forced adoption era involved hundreds of thousands of children taken from unwed mothers and placed in adoptive homes, often in situations that later turned abusive. In the United States, maternity homes and orphanages followed the same oppressive blueprint. During the mid-20th century, evangelical, Catholic, and secular institutions participated in coerced adoptions. The Florence Crittenton Homes, a national network with branches in Wisconsin, Illinois, and nearly every U.S. state, offered shelter for pregnant women, but at a cost. Women were pressured to give up their babies to wealthy, often white, adoptive families. The child was seen as the consequence to be erased, not the life to be cherished. In Wisconsin specifically, the Milwaukee County Temporary Home for Dependent Children and institutions run by private religious charities engaged in similar patterns. Babies were born under strict secrecy. The mother's name might not even appear on the birth certificate. After birth, the mother was often told she had no right to see or hold her child. A woman who refused to sign adoption papers was sometimes threatened with psychiatric commitment or cut off from basic shelter and support. How did this become so widespread across so many nations? The answer lies in deeply rooted historical and cultural narratives that treated women as morally responsible for upholding sexual purity and viewed pregnancy outside of marriage as moral collapse. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the ideal woman was imagined as pure, domestic, and obedient. A pregnant, unmarried woman upended that narrative. She became a visible symbol of defiance to social order, and that defiance had to be hidden, punished, or corrected. The term most often used for these women was unwed mother, a phrase that carried with it not just a factual description, but a moral accusation. She was not simply a woman raising a child alone. She was a public embarrassment to her family and a threat to social order. What's almost always missing in these stories is the man. Where was he? In nearly all these cases, he was absent. There was no social punishment, no forced accountability, no stigma. The man who fathered the child was rarely named, rarely held responsible, and rarely even mentioned. This system was propped up by religious institutions that conflated sexuality with sin, governments that deferred child welfare responsibilities to churches, families that feared social shame more than they feared abandoning their daughters, communities that policed women's bodies, gossiping, shunning, and judging. The shame wasn't just about religion, it was about control. Unwed mothers challenged the illusion of the ideal family, and so their realities were pushed underground, often literally, in places like Tuam. The psychological toll on women who survived these institutions often never recovered fully. Many suffered lifelong grief, shame, and PTSD. Some never spoke of the children they were forced to give up. Others were re-traumatized later in life when they discovered how their children had been treated, or that their children had died without their knowledge. Adopted children, too, were not untouched by this legacy. In many families, the fact that a child was adopted was considered shameful and hidden for decades. In the United States through the 1950s and even into the 1980s, it was common for children to grow up never knowing they were adopted, or only finding out in adulthood due to a slip, a document, or a relative finally breaking the silence. The secrecy itself was part of the stigma, a deep cultural message that something was wrong with being adopted or being born out of wedlock. In some cases, children were told they were not really part of the family, were treated differently, or internalized the idea that their origin story made them unworthy. The shame lived not only in the mothers, but in the generations that followed. In modern times, women who choose to raise their children alone still face isolation, financial hardship, and emotional exhaustion. Friends drift away. Family support evaporates. Romantic partners often see single mothers as less than or too much. With the liberalization of abortion laws in many countries, the landscape shifted, but not always in the ways people expected. For many women, especially those lacking emotional, relational, or financial support, abortion became less a choice and more a social pressure. They were told, "You'll ruin your life," "No man will want you," or "It's not fair to the child." The same voices that once shamed women for being unwed mothers now shamed them into ending pregnancies before they disrupted public comfort. And now, with abortion laws tightening in many places, including the United States, another dangerous pendulum swing is occurring. When the state mandates childbirth but offers no tangible support, no childcare, healthcare, housing, or protection, it traps vulnerable women in the same cycle of shame, silence, and abandonment. Women in unsafe or coercive situations are forced to carry pregnancies with no safety net, repeating the injustices of the past under a new name. The real issue is not whether abortion is legal or illegal. It is whether women are given real, supported human freedom. The tragedy of history is that women were once forced to give up their children. The tragedy of today is that many are still forced either to abort or to give birth, under systems that refuse to value their lives. Today's echoes, red pill culture, and emotional neglect. The digital age has not ended this stigma, it has morphed it. Online subcultures such as red pill, incel, and manosphere communities now openly target single mothers with language that is hostile, demeaning, and violent. These communities describe single mothers as burdens, warning men to never date a woman with a child. The shame that once lived in whispers now thrives in hashtags. What's worse, women who reach out for emotional support often find themselves dismissed, ghosted, or mocked for being too emotional. They are seen as liabilities, not as people who deserve care. The same cycle of silence, exploitation, and abandonment repeats. The consequences of silence. The most dangerous myth we still carry is that this is just history, but history leaves living legacies. Women who were isolated then are raising children who often carry unspoken grief. Generations were built on secrets, lies, and unresolved sorrow. Every unmarked grave, every forged adoption paper, every woman left alone in a hospital. These are not anomalies. They are evidence of a systemic war on women's dignity and their children's lives. Even into the 1960s and beyond, adoption was treated as something shameful. Women who became pregnant often hid their pregnancies, traveled far from home to give birth in secret, and never spoke of the child again. In many cases, families lied to children for decades, fearful that the truth would bring shame or scandal. Adopted children were often told later in life, sometimes by accident, that their identity had been hidden from them. This legacy has created deep emotional fractures, even among those adopted into loving homes. The shame was systemic, not just for the mothers, but for the children, and even for the adoptive families, who were told to pretend the child had no past, breaking the cycle. The truth is, a child born outside of marriage is not a scandal. A woman who chooses to raise a child alone is not a mistake. A society that treats her that way is. We can begin to repair this by acknowledging the historical atrocities fully, demanding records be unsealed and survivors be heard, creating tangible support systems for single mothers, ending the casual, normalized shaming of women who parent alone, calling out and rejecting online cultures that glorify misogyny, advocating for policies that support real freedom of choice with dignity and resources, not shame and abandonment, holding men equally accountable for the children they help create and the futures they impact by walking away, rewriting the narrative. The excavation in Tuam is not just about bones. It is about memory, about justice, about truth. Those nearly 800 infants remind us of the cost of silence. But there are living women, right now, who are walking reminders too. They show up to work, to school drop-offs, to grocery lines with tired eyes and unmatched strength. They carry the legacy of generations before them who were silenced, shamed, and discarded. Let us not wait until their stories are over to dignify them. Let us not need graves to believe them. Let us finally say what should have been said all along. You were never the problem. You were always the proof that love endured.